Welcome to JustWannaQuilt, a research podcast coming out of Tulane University Law School, where we explore all kinds of things, stories about quilting, tools, field trips, maybe some famous quilters stop by, and, of course, a little bit of copyright thrown in just for fun. This is Elizabeth Townsend Guard. I'm a law professor at Tulane University Law School, and I just wanna quilt. So today we talk with Lucas Osborn. He is a law professor at Campbell University School of Law in Raleigh, North Carolina, and he was suggested by a mutual friend, a mutual colleague at the University of Houston, that we must interview him, and indeed, we must. He's teaching us about 3D printing. Oh, the possibilities. A 2L law student joins us who's been working on digital printing and technology. So what we thought I'd do is, we could talk about what is 3D printing. Your audience is people that probably don't know very much. Some do. We have some scientists and we have everybody you can imagine listening. So it isn't just, it isn't what you think. It's not like just grandmas, like that kind of concept of grandma's quilting. It's pretty much everybody in every walk of life. And it's like a $5 billion industry with a lot of technology. Like, we all love the toys. So we want to learn more about 3D printing, sort of what your research is. Evan has some questions for you as well. And then we'll return back to sort of where we might think about this being applied to quilting. And I'll sort of leave that part of the discussion and chat with you about that. Does that sound like a good... okay, hold on just a second. Say hi to...
So my background in 3D printing was I was actually a contributing writer for 3dprintingindustry.com.
Okay.
And it was a few hundred articles that I was writing. So this was more at the beginning stage when it was starting to get known in the community. It was really big, in these pockets like in Europe and stuff like this and here in the US. And a lot of it was, everything seemed novel. Like anytime they made there was a foot that like a 3D printed foot for a duck, that made news kind of a thing. Right. So I was wondering if you could, in one of your articles, the Regulating Three-Dimensional Printing, Converging World of Bits and Atoms, which is fascinating, by the way. What can you just briefly, for I guess the audience, kind of describe the difference between the major types of 3D printing, like the additive manufacturing, where it's binding, or the other kinds, if you could break that down?
Yeah, so to start, I'll answer Elizabeth's question first, just the very basics of 3D printing before we talk about 3D printing types. So 3D printing is basically an automated way of manufacturing that uses digital files as inputs, and the 3D printer follows whatever the digital file says and builds the object up layer by layer. So I think that's conceptually the first thing to understand, is that 3D printers work kind of like building a brick wall, where you build the first layer of the wall, then you build the second layer on top. It's the same thing with a 3D printer. You've got some sort of nozzle or some sort of, we'll call it a nozzle, that extrudes or squirts out something. The simplest ones are melted plastic. And from the digital file, it will, if you imagine, let's say, slicing an apple into a bunch of thin layers, what the nozzle will do is squirt the first layer of molten plastic down, and then it will move the printer head up just maybe a fraction of a millimeter, lay the second layer down, and so forth. And so that's really the basics of how a 3D printer works. It's like building a brick wall, kind of layer by layer. And there are different types. So the types that you tend to see in the home right now are the melted plastics, the material that you use in kayaks and canoes and that sort of thing, are just heated up and melted, kind of like a hot glue gun, and you lay those down layer by layer. The more industry-specific printers are the metal printers, certain polymer printers, and even you can print in human cells. They have these hydrogel human cell mixtures where they lay down the human cells on some sort of structure and grow miniature organs, or fully usable. I think the first 3D printed organ in a human was a bladder, and I think they celebrated 10 or 15 years.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
So they range from a couple of $100 to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on what material you're using, what methodology you're using. So there's toys for anybody and everybody.
Cool.
It's okay to ask.
Let's just ask our intro question before we continue.
Oh yeah,
on.
My bad. I would jump really into it really quick.
It's all good. So just for preservation purposes, tell me your name and where you're calling from.
Lucas Osborn. I'm a professor of law at Campbell University in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Awesome. And do you have a memory of someone sewing or quilting in your life?
Sewing, very basic sewing. My mother did when I was younger, just, a button fell off here or that sort of thing. Quilting, my only connection to quilting is that I have a quilt in my house. I don't know if my grandmother made it or somebody above her made it, but we have it still in our house. It's on our guest bed and it's nice and cozy, but I never saw actual quilting happen, but I'm glad to still have that quilt and keep it and use it. So that's about the extent of my quilting connection.
Interesting. So quilting, as I was saying before I got interrupted, quilting is not what you think it is. So there's tons of technology in quilting, tons of patenting happening. The toys are a really important part of quilting at this point. We are interviewing somebody who does these weird sort of dentist-like glasses after we chat with you today. So it's just like this thing. So what I thought would be great would be, you explain what 3D printing is. What I thought we would do is talk more about sort of what kind of issues are coming up, and then also a little bit about patents and a little bit about sort of the relationship of all of this to quilting. So do you want to ask the next question about sort of yeah, do you want to?
Oh no,
It's all good?
I'll leave it to you. And then
no, it's all good. Okay, so 3D printing. So you told us a little bit about the basics of it. Do you see it being used in? I know the answer to this because we talked about your article. But do you see this used in art at all? Like, do you see when people see a 3D printing, they think of first of all, they think of I think probably, oh my gosh, they might reprint guns, right? That's one thing that comes up, and medical technology. But why are we talking about 3D printing on a quilting podcast? Do you see it as part of the artistic art space?
Yeah, in fact, that's probably the space that DIY, do-it-yourself, individual home-based printing. That's probably the area that it's already impacting most quickly, right? So people are using 3D printing from the very simplest things like printing figurines. People are making 3D selfies of themselves. They are printing jewelry or molds to make jewelry. So these are the kinds of things that are artistic in nature that even individual users have access to today. On sort of even things like painting that you think of as two-dimensional, actually, if you followed the new Rembrandt or the latest Rembrandt, where some people used artificial intelligence, fed in all of Rembrandt's paintings, and had the artificial intelligence computer come up with a new Rembrandt painting, because Rembrandt tended to paint most people the same from the head down to about the mid-chest level. And so this AI took note of how Rembrandt drew and then generated what they thought would be another portrait done by Rembrandt. Then those people took that image, but it was not just a two-dimensional image, it was three-dimensional based on the brush strokes that Rembrandt would use. And they used a 3D printer to recreate the texture and the brush strokes that Rembrandt would have used. So, it really can infect areas that you don't even think about in terms of arts and crafts and that sort of thing.
Right, and it looks like I just googled it, the new Rembrandt. It looks like it just looks like a Rembrandt painting. It's kind of remarkable,
Right.
So I know some museums are using this technology, for paintings and sculptures to, create an access or maybe put out the 3D printed version and keep the original safe and hidden deep in the basements. But So one of my what I'm researching is forgery, and I was wondering, as this technology becomes more prevalent, do you see this touching into forgery, and then how technology can then determine whether or not this Rembrandt is authentic or not?
Yeah, you touch on a really important thing I think about the technology that excites me is the ability to digitize very rare artifacts and recreate those artifacts in very good detail, which really expands access to art and to especially sculpture and those sorts of things, or to ancient creations. And that way you can have the version that everybody can touch and everybody can see, and researchers can study up close and learn new things about. So I think that's important. As to whether it can be used for forgery, sure. I mean, every technology has its good and its bad uses. And I think people need to be aware of that moving forward. And it will be a very case-by-case, case-specific thing as to whether a forgery is a big problem that's difficult to detect, or upon close inspection, you can actually see that, well, this is a recreation. It's not the exact thing. And it's helpful as a recreation for us to touch and interact with and to display in multiple places, but nobody's that's at least moderately expert, has expertise, is going to be fooled by.
Interesting. Now, is there copyright on these? Like obviously the technology is going to be protected by patent, and potentially even the thing you're printing might be protected by a patent. But like the Rembrandt painting and the artwork, who's the author of the Rembrandt painting, and is it protected by copyright or not?
Well, the Rembrandt one is an interesting question that
Right.
I think people have been debating about for at least a decade now, as to author-generated, computer-generated
Right.
work.
That's
So I don't have the answer to that. At some point, a computer could be autonomous enough that it would be at best arbitrary to assign a human creator to anything output by the computer program. If the computer program is designed by a certain person and that person has a lot of input or say as to what that computer is going to output, then it might make sense to call that individual programmer or creator also the creator of the other output. But that's a question of intense debate, shall we say,
Right.
even the scholarly circles. But what should be very clear to people is that 3D printing of creative objects like sculptures and those sorts of things, if the physical object or the digital version of that object is creative, there's copyright protection there. There's just no question about
Yeah.
it. Just
Because the form doesn't matter, right? We don't care about what form it takes. If it's a human's creating it, we're fine. It's just we're not super keen on non-humans getting copyright.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So, all right. So 3D printing. So, what kind of problems do you see with 3D printing? What worries you with 3D printing? You do a bunch of scholarship on it, so I'm curious what your worries are and how we understand that as the general public. When we hear 3D printing, what should we be scared of? Help us know our worries on this area.
Well, I think the thing that probably the public most associates as a worry is the 3D printed guns or weapons, that sort of thing.
Huge, right? Everybody's worried about it because there's like great movies about that.
Right. And there's going to be more. I mean, being able to print in materials that are undetectable by metal detectors, but yet can inflict lethal damage. I mean,
Right.
Things were all theoretically possible, and people that really cared could create those weapons. But now you're really talking about democratizing access to that sort of technology. And that is worrisome. I think we have a lot of tools to control that.
Yeah.
To some extent, I think perfect control is going to be impossible. So, I haven't focused my scholarship on the sort of guns and the other things. My scholarship is mainly focused on intellectual property and the things that I think, specifically what I think are the unique challenges brought by 3D printing. So copyright is mostly well prepared for what I call physicization, the digitization of physical objects, right? Copyright is used to saying, well, it doesn't matter if it's a record or a CD or an MP3 file. If if it's creative, it's infringing, and that's the end of it. And I think that copyright is pretty well prepared. Patent law, on the other hand, not so much, right?
Yeah.
Because patent has never really thought about, well, what if you have a digital version of this patented object? What kind of protections are there? And in fact, patent law in some ways may underprotect the digital versions of these inventions.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think part of it is a technological peculiarity. So to understand it simply, to put it simply, if you're creating a digital version of an object, the first thing you would do is you'd be in a CAD program and you would...
So explaining, yeah.
If you could just break down what CAD stands for, just, yeah.
CAD is computer-aided drafting. So that is, instead of drawing by hand a blueprint, you're in a computer program that helps you create a digital blueprint of an object.
Yeah.
And what 3D printing does is take that digital blueprint and allow you to actually manufacture whatever you've designed in the digital environment.
Uh-huh.
But in 3D printing, it's a 3-step digital process. So first, you're in the CAD program, which those have been around for years because people have done digital blueprints just for the sake of not having to draw with pen and paper and erase and that sort of thing. But if you want a 3D print, you take that digital CAD drawing and you translate it in what's called a surface mesh file, or the most popular format is an STL file. That's just like a DOC is a Word document. STL is the extension for the most popular surface mesh file. What a surface mesh file is the surface representation of whatever object you've designed. So it's a 3-dimensional surface representation made up of a bunch of little triangles. Why it doesn't have to be triangles, but that's what it is. You're breaking the surface down instead of a real surface, which might be totally smooth. Computers work in slightly different ways, so it works in terms of patching a bunch of triangles together to make whatever shape you're trying to create. So if you imagine a ball, you would divide that ball up into the surface of that ball up into a bunch of small triangles. The smaller the triangles, the better the resolution. The bigger the triangles, the worse the resolution. And this file, this surface mesh file, is the version that is bought and sold and offered for free on all these websites. And it's kind of like the PDF of 3D printing.
Yeah.
Everybody can access it. Everybody can play with it.
Yeah.
But that's not the file that actually instructs your printer. That's kind of this generic surface representation that needs to be translated into a third file format, which is kind of a machine instruction format. It's the most common is called G code because of the letter G, because of the way the commands work. But that G code file is very specific to your 3D printer. And so it knows your 3D printer's material, your 3D printer's setting. And so because it's so specific to an individual printer or a set of printers, people don't buy and sell in that format, because if you try to print my G-code file on your different printer, you're just going to get mush.
How does the G-code, so if you have that middle file, how does the G-code file get created if each printer is a little bit different?
Right. So everybody with a 3D printer has to have a computer with slicer software. They call it slicer software because it takes that surface representation and slices it into the individual layers that the 3D printer is actually going to lay down. So it slices it and it traces it and basically tells the 3D printer, here's the tool path. You need to start at XY coordinate, 0, 0, and lay down some goop or lay down some material along this path, then raise up a fraction of a millimeter, let's lay down and so forth. And so here's the problem. Now the patent problem gets into the weeds of patent law a little bit, but let me put it this way. Patent law is driven by patent claims that have to be very specific, and they're interpreted very literally. And so for various reasons, if you want to claim a digital file as a patentable thing, you need to claim a digital file or program that tells a computer to do something.
Yep.
Well, the only kind of digital file that tells a computer to do something in a way that patent law sees as viable or eligible for patenting is that final format, the machine instruction file, because it's the only one that's saying, hey, machine, do this, then do that.
It's like a process. It's actually doing something as opposed to an artwork. It's that distinction between copyright and patent. So for those that are listening that we haven't done much on patents, we're starting to, we have a whole project on the patentability of rulers that we're doing, which is a whole huge weird thing. So the claim is really the property right in patent. So, and what you mean by a claim is it's very complicated. It's super technical. It says and it's fancy. That's like fancy words. And that little bit of how you're describing the invention and that little bit of invention that you're claiming for the patent, that's what you're talking about. So that when you translate it to these files, the question is, what's the thing, and what is the claim, and that you have to look to this machine readable file to figure out what the claim is. That's really interesting. Now, do you feel like there'll be a time when it isn't separate? So I can see you saying, well, we're patenting this really cool thimble that does something that no thimbles have ever done, and you're going to put it into the patent office. The patent office says yes, and then you're printing them, you're making them on a 3D printer. That's different than, say, something kind of born 3D printer that you're trying to patent. Would you say that, like, it's all about that file? It's not about sort of the application of, one's an application of, I'm just going to manufacture it through 3D printing. The other one is, it is about the file itself that the patent should be, you should try to get the patent on. Is that what you're saying?
Well, you want both, right?
Yeah.
So if the physical object is patentable, great, patent it.
Yeah.
But what you're worried about, kind of like, an analogy to Napster or Grokster or what.
Okay, well, so we have to, so you got to back up. So Napster and Grokster are a little, so for our audience, they don't know what that is. So Napster was when people were file sharing with illegally downloading files, and the copyright world said, no, that's not super grand. And so what you're saying is that this kind of the Wild West of Napster and Grokster, where everyone was sharing files and doing files, that's what you're, so tell me more about what you're going to say next.
Yeah, so the problem, if you're the patent owner, is not only do I want to stop people from making the digital version, I also recognize that the physical version. The digital version, I really want to control that too, because I can't stop everybody from 3D printing. I don't know who's 3D printing in their home. I don't know what they're doing. So what I really would like to do to preserve the value of my patent is stop the digital version from being shared, from being copied, from being sold,
really
unless I'm the one doing the selling. Right?
And you think patents is the way to do that, is to protect somehow the digital version through patent law?
Well, I think you can offer some protections, but they're limited. And it goes back to those file formats. So,
all right. So I have another question then, because this is another stressful space for me. And then Evan's got a ton of questions, and we're so not staying to our time frame. So it really seems like the digital file is directions. And directions aren't necessarily protectable under copyright, under a traditional view of like recipes. My theory is that we've misunderstood that if it's a useful object, sure, the directions aren't protectable. But if it's the Rembrandt painting, that those directions really are creating art, and therefore they should be protectable because they're just another expression of that art. That direction is the expression of the art. What do you think about that theory of our concept of recipes and directions?
I agree 100%.
You do?
And I've gotten a ton of pushback on that.
Really? We should write a paper together.
Sounds
because
like a good idea.
I see it from the copyright side of it. People make these patterns, and then they're like, oh, well, the directions aren't protectable. But the directions are teaching you how to make the art. So I think we should write together. Because from your side of it and from my side of it, very different, right? But the same problem.
Yeah, I think that what the law should do is distinguish. If you're providing instructions to create something creative, you're protected.
Yeah.
And that's actually how the law of copyright and software works.
That's right.
So,
Software is, so that's what the analogy we've been using is, so software does get protected by copyright. It's not the functionality of it, but the expression.
Right.
And then the question is, where is that divide? And I think that for both the 3D printing and the quilting, there is a divide that one is expression, one is functionality. And so the question is that we can't just say, oh, no, it's like a recipe, they're not protected.
Yeah. I think that's right. I'll send you my book chapter when we're done. Send me if I don't remember, because it's funny you bring this up, because I think 3D printing files really get to the heart of this. If I have a 3D printing file that will print a sculpture, it's clearly copyright protected. If I have a 3D printing file that will print a purely useful object,
right,
I don't think it should be protected by copyright law.
Me too.
But I get a ton of pushback from at least half of the scholars I present this to, who say, no, you got it all wrong.
Why?
It's a drawing, and technical drawings are specifically listed under the copyright statute. And so the drawing.
Right, so they're going further. So they're going the other side. So we get like, oh, well, if you make a pattern of a llama, that llama, and it's all these little intricate steps you have to do to get to the llama. The steps aren't protectable. That the image of the llama is, but I say the steps are the image. Like there's no difference between the two. Like that's and it isn't useful articles doctrine. You're going further and saying that even though it's creating a useful article, the underlying, it could be protected, but it's just not protected much, right? I mean, the functionality isn't protected.
Right. I go a step further, which we get into the weeds of the useful article doctrine, and say, actually the drawing of the digital version of the object doesn't have anything that copyright law considers creativity.
Yeah.
And therefore, even the image of the file is not protectable.
I kind of like that, actually.
It's copyrightable because of the ancillary labels and other things that count as creativity.
Yeah. No, I like that. I like that a lot. I mean, I think about like what we've been doing for the last year, this immersive, ridiculous research, and that makes a lot of sense to me. I can sort of see why we got it's like a first date or whatever. I'm married, but I'm just saying that like people like, you have to talk to Lucas, and I'm like, I don't know why, but now I do. I totally get it, right? Because we're talking about the same thing and we're looking at the same thing, but from very different perspectives. And that's what copyright law and that's what IP scholars are doing when we study clowns or we study 3D printing, because when you're immersed in the space, you start to really understand the relationship between law and the role of creativity. And what you're saying is, just because you spend a lot of time on a file doesn't mean you get copyright protection, because it's a useful article. And in copyright, we don't protect useful articles, patent does. So that's what you're saying, is don't get fooled by the form it's taking, you have to look to sort of what it is more than just the form.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So I had a quick question, because I know when I was doing my writing that a big part of 3D printing, it was also the culture of 3D printing, especially the DIY community, and how that overlaps with maybe the desire as it's growing to protect patents, to protect copyright. But there's such a huge culture of sharing and this idea of like, well, once I put it out there, it's for the world type thing, but then maybe having second thoughts once it's out there.
Yeah, I think the DIY culture and the what is called open hardware in the 3D printing space is equivalent to open source software, which is I create the software code and then I give it away for free. That's why it's open. It's open, or at least open source means you can see all the code and you can study it. And then free and open source means not only can you study it, but I'm offering it for free. Same thing with open hardware and free open hardware is I create a digital version and then I post it online for anybody and everybody to download for free. And that gets to a normative question or a policy-based question, which is, can they do that? Sure. Can they change their mind and claim patent protection? Maybe. But what does this tell us about the incentive story that copyright and patent law is built around, right? Which is copyrights and patents are in the United States seen to incentivize creativity and incentivize ingenuity, inventions, right? So the idea is, because I can make money off these and nobody can copy them for a little while, I'm more incentivized to create these things. But if people might claim copyright protection or patent protection, but choose not to, that tells us that at least some creations don't need that patent or copyright incentive, right? Then it becomes an empirical question that might be very tough to answer, with precision. But what does that mean for the balance of the copyright and the patent system in light of these technologies? These technologies, 3D printing especially, really lower the cost of innovation, the cost of creating an initial prototype, the cost of changing that prototype based on new information, the cost of distributing that to other people, and same with copyright as well. It makes it easier in a sense to create a sculpture because I can do so digitally, which requires one set of skills, but I don't necessarily need to have the skills that a chisel and whatever else goes into sculpting, which I don't know.
Yeah.
So it becomes an interesting set of questions.
Interesting. Do you have another question?
I'm worried about the 945 thing.
That's okay.
And bring it back to quilting.
Okay, so my big question is, do you 3D print?
I don't own a 3D printer in my house, which makes me...
Your dean. You got to ask your dean for one. That's the thing, right?
Yeah.
That's the big ask. To be like, hey, dean, I need a 3D printer in my office.
Or it makes me a underpaid law professor, and I should have stayed in practice law. And
Totally. No, totally.
But I have access to them through the university.
Yeah. Do their
So,
makerspace and all that, right? Do they have a makerspace? And so we have one here too. Now I really want to go and learn more about it. So
Oh, sorry. One thing I wanted to ask, because I know that this can sometimes be, for a community it's not familiar with 3D printing. What are some things that maybe people think, or you've heard that people might think that is possible 3D printing, but actually isn't? Like, you can't just. I know you mentioned that at home it's usually plastic material, and then outside there's human cells, things like that. But can you put in, say, just break it down? Like, what type of materials can we actually be printing now to a higher grade?
And also that was my related question of, can you 3D print fabric or quilts or those sorts of things?
Yeah. So the current limitations, and this stuff is developing very rapidly on several fronts: the materials that you can print in, the software and how good it is, and the 3D printers themselves. So those are three areas of innovation that are just rapidly progressing. What is difficult right now is to print in multiple materials, right? So we're not going to be printing an iPhone anytime soon. You can't right now print circuits that are that small compared to the multi-billion-dollar semiconductor industry, right? You can print simple circuits with 3D printers right now. You can print in a couple of different materials, but it's challenging. If the plastic melts at one temperature and you're trying to print in metal that melts at a much higher temperature and then ruins the plastic that you've just laid down, you've got some issues, right? And so things with multiple materials are tricky. They're not impossible, but they're tricky, especially depending on the multiple materials. With enough money and with enough time, you can print amazing things. So the second question becomes a practical one, which is, what can I print that's cost competitive as a true end manufacturing? And that's a limited thing.
So are the resources with 3D printing have to be gooey? Like, do they have to be melty or painty or like not like kind of in a sort of liquidy state? Is that kind of part of what 3D printing does, or can it be like something else?
So it can be a variety of things. A lot of the metals are actually ground into powder first. The powder is sprayed out and a laser hits it at just the right moment and melts the powder.
Really?
You think of it welding.
And then do you have any that are like soft and cuddly, or is it always like metal, plastic, So
you can print in polymers, and the way these works, they're actually vats of liquid that you shine a light, ultraviolet or whatever light on, and it hardens that layer of polymer, and then you 3D print sort of that way. But the polymers that you use can be somewhat soft. I've not seen anything like that would feel like cloth. I haven't seen that. You can print in sort of wood-based materials, ceramic-based materials,
right.
But
we're not 3D printing clothing yet. Is that what you're saying?
Well, there is 3D printed clothing, and there are, like I said, soft and pliable polymers. But these 3D printed clothing that you see right now are mostly the equivalent of chainmail. So a lot of little rings or shapes that are interconnected.
And, so we can do cosplay. Is that what you're saying?
Oh yes, yeah. That's
cosplay.
You can make Loki's helmet.
Like chainmail, but they're the same basic idea where you have a bunch of rings that are connected to form the fabric. That's what I've seen mostly in terms of material that we would think of as clothes.
Interesting.
The fashion, people are doing, and it hits the runway. How much that'll be sold in stores, I don't know.
Interesting. Okay, and then the other question I had is, so like, let's say the other thing I see is that people are like, oh, well, I have this. Let's go back to the thimble. A thimble I really want. Like, I like it. I want to make a bunch of them myself, or they're out of copyright. I mean, they're out. There's no protection on these. There's no patent on them or anything. How hard is it to scan that thimble and then make them into the like? There's the cost element of how expensive it is and access to the equipment, but like the practicality of scanning the beautiful sculpture or the thimble, like, is it really being done? And how do you? And now I totally want to do it, right?
Right.
Yeah, I totally want to
do
this.
So that's the one thing we haven't talked about is another way to reverse engineer a physical object is just to scan it with a 3D scanner. And these scanners, your smartphone with an app can be a 3D scanner. It's not going to be a great one, but you can do that.
Yeah.
Now, realistically, right now where the software is, it's not just a one-step process where I run a scanner and I'm ready to print.
Yeah.
The scanned file needs some massaging by someone who has at least some familiarity with how to use the digital software, the kind of CAD software and other software that we talked about. Typically, if it's a real simple object, maybe you can get away, or you need a rough scan, probably scan it and then turn around and print it pretty easily. But realistically speaking, if you want a detailed, good scan that can be turned around and be 3D printed, you probably need to manipulate that scan a little bit, which can be done, again, at a university lab or these maker spaces, that sort of thing. But there is a little learning that goes into it. And I got a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old, and this summer I'm going to spend a week or two teaching them the very basics of CAD design, because you can go online and get these free programs that have 100 tutorials on them, starting from the very basic shape to how to use these CAD.
That's very cool. Can you send me a link to that stuff? Because I would love to add that tutorials. Because I imagine there are people out there that would be really interested on. Yeah,
I'll send you a link, but you can also just Google free.
Just do free Google. I didn't know if there were ones that you were like, this is the good one. Okay, cool. Well, do you have another question?
I wanted to bring it back to quilting.
Quilting. So we're not super worried that 3D printing is going to take over our life, but if they can figure out how to make the gooey stuff more soft, then we might be able to do some 3D printing of. Because I can see, we're kind of like a Rembrandt, right? We're just different layers of different things. We're many, many layers. So if you could layer stuff, we could have the layer, we have the bottom layer, the backing, we have the batting, which is a different fabric. We have another thing that's all the piecing and the different levels of the piecing, and then we have quilting. So we kind of really have 4 layers on a quilt. And that's really kind of what 3D printing is doing, is many, many, many layers. It's just you're not quite there yet on the soft, cozy part yet.
Right. Yeah, I think where 3D printing will affect quilting, and this is where, we'd have to put our heads together.
Yeah.
But, I went around and Googled just a little bit about individual home-based quilting. Yeah. And I see there's a bunch of tools that people use, right?
Tons.
And some of the oddly shaped rulers or plastic things that help you quilt in a certain pattern. And that's the kind of stuff where if you say, I really want to quilt in this pattern, and nobody sells this tool, that's where you could work with somebody who's familiar with 3D printing.
So you think like 3D printing? Hold on, I'm going to get something real quick. You keep asking questions.
So not to go on too much of a tangent really quick, but something I was thinking about while I was reading one of your articles was the personalized element to say something like if you don't have access to a Gucci type thing or something like that, but you can get the outline and then kind of personalize it. And this reminded me a lot of like 90s hip hop culture where you would personalize these types of things. And I was wondering if you see issues in terms of trademark or patent with that as well, and liability. Absolutely. And who then, and then if it's, bit torrented, how do you track down? I know those are a lot of questions in one, but I was wondering if you could just kind of touch on that really quick.
Yeah, trademark stuff is happening because people are posting either, let's say, a model of a Ford car or a model of a BMW that's 3D printable, and it's got the BMW or the Ford logo. And, if this stuff starts making money, making a lot of sales, you can very much imagine trademark owners stepping in and saying, that's enough. The simple things that you can get right now is you can get a phone case. You can go online to thingiverse.com or any of these 3D printing websites. And if you want a phone case with a given trademark that you like, Louis Vuitton, Nike, whatever, you can get an iPhone case right now, download it and print it. And the trademark companies aren't bothered by that, probably because it's such low volume,
it's like that fan stuff, right? It's the fan, right. It's just not, it's not worth their time.
Yeah.
All right, here we go. All right, so this, can you see it? Foot.
Yep.
Right? That's just a foot for, right? That 3D printing, you could do your own feet, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, easy.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. This seems to me like totally. So these are like weird design things. So you follow it with this really fancy machine we have, but there's not a lot of these, so you could probably make your own pretty easily. They're just like grooves, right?
Right.
Totally, right?
And where 3D printing kind of comes is right now profitable in terms of industry making final products are specialized products that are sold at relatively low volumes, right? So maybe only 100 people want this particular quilting pattern. Right. But guess what? 3D printers don't care whether they're 100 of the exact same thing.
And you think like something like this would be, first of all, it wouldn't be hard to design, right? Super easy to design. And it's probably not protectable. I don't know. We'll have to see what Grace Company says. The actual thing, making one of these because you have 7 of these or 8 of these that you make, you hook them together. But none of that's protectable, right? That's probably not protectable. It might have a patent, but it doesn't look like it does. I don't see anything on it. That's pretty, that's like nothing. How much do you think that this would be like a thing you could make and then sell with a 3D, like your own version of whatever it is, like flowers or whatever?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, we're doing this.
One thing, if I'm being real practical, what about the size of that is some of the home-based 3D printers have a relatively small, what's called a build volume.
Yeah.
You can think of it as a printer in a cube.
Yeah.
And so something that wide.
We need to do at the university, right?
Right, exactly.
I am so going to our makerspace. We are so making these. And Evan and others are going to make a really cool design so we can sort of do this and make our own version. Because these are a bit dull, I have to say. This is kind of not very exciting. You know what I'm saying? Like you could make a lot more interesting.
Yeah, one of the catchphrases in the 3D printing space is that complexity is free. Because your 3D printer doesn't get tired. It doesn't get worn out trying to make intricate details. The movements are inconsequential to the 3D printer, so it doesn't care if it's printing 100 different things or 100 of the same things.
And then it doesn't care if it's thickness. So these are stencils. Okay, these are very common, right? So you could make these in 3D printer as well, right? Because you just need to you just put your design in with the little lines and then it prints it out really thin.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so you can do all kinds of weird designs. We are so invading the makerspace.
There you go.
Okay, cool. And then also this is the last thing. This one is, this is one of our favorite people. There's all kinds of weird rulers. So look at this. Right. There's a gargantuan ruler. This is for making t-shirt quilts. So that you can sort of identify it. But I imagine 3D printers are great at rulers as well because you can kind of make your own template or rulers, and this is pretty simple. Yeah?
Right. That's definitely doable as well.
We are so going to invade the makerspace. This is so cool. Well, I am really, really psyched about your work. I can't wait to actually. Oops, I don't know why it got so weird. The lighting got weird. I must have hit the thing. I'm really psyched about your work. I can't wait to read it more. I really do think we should do a paper or presentation somewhere together, because we are so not what you think that you and I would be in sync, because I do this wood quilting stuff, you do the cool 3D stuff, but we're right on the same page with this, and I think that's really interesting. I think it'd be great.
Very good.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, cool. Well, any other quilting related issues we might solve for you today? No?
None that I can think of, but I'll look at the quilt in my guest bedroom with a lot more.
Oh, very cool. Well, send us a picture of that quilt. I'll post it on the, and then you're working on your book right now. Is that right?
That's right. I should finish up the manuscript draft in the next 4 or 5 days, hopefully.
Awesome.
So.
Well, once the book comes out, come back and talk with us about it again. So we have lots of scholars and interesting. We interview lots of people. So I'm just so psyched. This is really great. If we start to 3D print stuff, I'll let you know, because it would be really fun to tell you what we're doing. I'm a little nervous about it because it seems like a big dive into something new, but I think we should try the 3D printing and experience it and see what it is. And see how hard it is. So we'll have to get some students on that for next semester to design stuff. So thank you so much for your time. Do you need to review this before we post it?
No, thanks so much for having me, and feel free to post it.
Awesome. Well, we'll send you a link so you can send it all to all your quilting friends and other non-quilting friends once it posts. But really, I'm really psyched that we chatted, and this is great. This is super great.
Great. Thanks so much again.
All right, take care. Bye.
All right, you too. Bye.
So you've been listening to Just Wanna Quilt, a research podcast coming out of Tulane University Law School. And I'm Elizabeth Townsend-Gard. If you like this podcast, keep listening. Also, we have a Facebook group. Come join us. We talk about a lot of things. We also have an Instagram account. And of course, most importantly, I really hope you get a chance to quilt today.